I still remember the night I felt myself disappearing from the very life I had built. It wasn't sudden. It was like watching pieces of myself being peeled away, little by little, until there was nothing left that belonged to me. The warmth of a home turned cold, conversations became whispers behind closed doors, and the bond I thought unbreakable with my own daughter began to slip through my fingers. 5 years passed in silence, years where I carried scars no one else could see. Then one day, fate placed me in front of the very world that had erased me, standing tall, uninvited, and unseen until my presence made the air shift. Life doesn't always shatter in a single moment. Sometimes, it unravels slowly, so quietly that you don't even realize it's happening until you look around and find yourself standing in the ruins. That's how my erasure began, not with a fight, not with a betrayal I could point to, but with small, almost invisible moments that accumulated over time. I started noticing that the laughter that once filled my home didn't include me anymore. Conversations I was supposed to be a part of seemed to go on without me. At first, I thought it was nothing more than busy schedules, stress, or fatigue. But gradually, I saw a pattern. I would enter a room and voices would lower, eyes would glance away, and smiles that once welcomed me seemed forced or absent altogether. It was in the small gestures that I felt myself slipping away from them. A dinner table where my words no longer carried weight, where my stories were cut short or ignored, where silence became my only companion even though I was surrounded by people I loved. I tried harder at first, telling myself that maybe I wasn't giving enough, maybe I needed to push through the coldness and make the warmth return. I prepared meals with care, planned little surprises, and looked for any excuse to bring back the closeness that had defined our family. But the harder I tried, the more invisible I became. I remember one evening clearly, when my daughter was sharing something she was excited about. I leaned in, eager to ask her questions, to show her that I was listening, that I cared deeply. Before I could even finish a sentence, she cut me off and turned her attention elsewhere, laughing at something that excluded me. I sat there, smiling weakly, feeling like an outsider in my own home. It wasn't just her words. It was the way she didn't even notice that I was hurt, the way my absence in the conversation didn't matter. That was when the first real crack appeared inside me, though I buried it quickly and told myself not to overthink. The walls of the house that had once embraced me started feeling unfamiliar. Photos on the walls that should have represented shared memories began to look like a story I no longer belonged to. I was still in them, smiling, holding on to those captured seconds, but I could feel that the people in those frames were drifting away from the person I was becoming. They weren't looking at me the same way anymore. I was there physically, but emotionally, I was fading from their lives. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and with each passing moment, I could feel myself shrinking into a background figure. Decisions were made without me. Plans were drawn without my input. Even inside the house, I felt like a guest who overstayed her welcome. I told myself that families go through phases, that maybe it was just temporary, that maybe if I waited, things would shift back to how they once were, but the waiting only deepened the silence. What hurt the most wasn't anger or conflict, it was indifference. Anger still carries recognition, an acknowledgement that you exist enough to provoke something, but indifference? That's the cruelest form of erasure. It's standing right there, in front of the people who should love you most, and realizing they no longer see you at all. I could have screamed, cried, or begged for them to notice, but something inside me told me it would make no difference. And so, little by little, I learned to sit quietly, to swallow my words, to stop reaching out for hands that no longer reached back. I began to live like a shadow in my own world. I walked through hallways where laughter echoed behind closed doors, laughter that didn't pause when I passed by. I sat at dinners where my chair felt colder than the others, where my voice no longer registered. I went to bed with silence pressing down on me, lying next to someone who barely noticed whether I was there or not. That's how erasure feels. It isn't always a loud tearing apart, but a slow, relentless fading. And every day I could feel myself disappearing a little more, becoming someone whose presence no longer made a difference, whose absence wouldn't even leave a mark. The bond between a mother and her daughter is supposed to be unshakable. At least, that's what I believed for most of my life. I thought nothing in the world could place distance between us, because I had been there from the very first moment she opened her eyes, through scraped knees, school projects, whispered secrets, and bedtime stories. I was her safe place, her anchor, the one she ran to for comfort when the world felt too heavy. But slowly, without warning, that bond began to change, and the distance crept in so quietly I almost didn't notice at first. What began as small shifts eventually became a chasm so wide that I couldn't reach her anymore, no matter how desperately I tried. At first it was subtle, tiny signs that something wasn't right. She stopped sharing the little details of her day with me. Instead of rushing into my room with excitement to tell me about her friends, her grades, or the silly things that had happened, she would retreat into herself. The conversations that used to stretch into late nights became one-word answers, short nods, and distracted glances at her phone. I told myself it was just the natural growing pains of adolescence, that she needed her space and independence, that every child pulls away for a while. I convinced myself not to worry, that this was normal, but the changes didn't stop there. I began to notice the way her eyes avoided mine, how she would light up in conversations with others, but look past me when I tried to engage. It wasn't just teenage mood swings, it was something deeper, something colder. She was building walls I couldn't climb, walls I didn't understand. I tried harder to reach her, to remind her of the closeness we once shared. I planned outings for just the two of us, hoping to recreate the magic of those afternoons spent shopping, laughing, or simply sitting together. But every effort seemed to push her further away. She would cancel at the last minute, make excuses, or show up physically but with her heart clearly elsewhere. The rejection wasn't always loud. It was in the quiet refusals, the rolled eyes, the way she would dismiss my advice as if my voice had no value anymore. She began turning to others for guidance, asking questions she once would have whispered to me, sharing her struggles with people I barely knew. I felt replaced, left standing in the background while someone else filled the role that once defined me. That kind of pain doesn't break you in an instant. It eats at you slowly, filling you with doubt. What had I done wrong? Had I failed her somehow? Was I too strict, too soft, too present, or not present enough? The questions circled endlessly, but the answers never came. There were moments that cut deeper than any argument ever could, like the day I overheard her talking about me, her words laced with frustration, as if I were a burden rather than a blessing in her life. Or the time she walked past me in the hallway and acted as though I weren't even there, her eyes fixed on something in the distance, her body language screaming avoidance. I wanted to stop her, to pull her into my arms, and remind her of all the nights I held her when she cried, all the sacrifices I made to give her the life she had. But the truth was, she didn't want to be reminded. She didn't want me. The emotional rejection grew heavier with each passing day. I would sit alone, clutching old photographs where her tiny hand clung to mine, and wonder how we got here. How does a bond so sacred unravel to nothing? She didn't scream, she didn't push me away physically, but her silence, her indifference, was louder than any words could ever be. It was a rejection of my love, of my role as her mother, of everything I thought we shared. And no matter how much I tried to hold on, it slipped further from my grasp, leaving me with the unbearable realization that the daughter I once knew had slowly closed her heart to me. The years that followed were not loud or chaotic. They were quiet, heavy, and filled with a silence that never seemed to lift. When you are pushed out of the life you helped build, when the people you love most decide to move on without you, you are left with an emptiness that doesn't fade overnight. Those 5 years became a test of endurance, not of living in the way I once understood it, but of surviving in a world that no longer felt like it had a place for me. Each morning I woke up and carried the weight of absence of laughter in the kitchen, absence of footsteps running down the hallway, absence of voices that once called for me. The house I lived in felt more like a shell than a home, filled with echoes of a past life I couldn't reclaim. Sometimes I would catch myself setting 2 cups of tea out of habit, only to stare at the empty chair across from me, a painful reminder that my company was no longer wanted. In the beginning, I tried to fight the loneliness with distraction. I kept myself busy, pouring energy into chores, into tasks that didn't really matter but made the hours pass faster. I read books I didn't finish, cleaned rooms that didn't need cleaning, cooked meals that no one else would share with me. But the silence always found me. No matter what I did, it pressed against my chest, a constant reminder that I had been left behind. Nights were the hardest. Lying in the dark, I would replay conversations I wished I had, moments I wished I could change, words I should have spoken sooner or differently. Regret has a way of keeping you awake, and it was my constant companion. But even in that pain, something inside me refused to break completely. I learned how to carry the silence, how to exist within it without letting it destroy me. There is a certain strength that comes from being forced into solitude, from realizing that no one is coming to save you, that you have to become your own source of survival. I found small routines that became lifelines, morning walks where the air felt like a reminder that I was still alive, journaling late at night to pour out emotions that had no other place to go, sitting by the window and watching people live their lives while I pieced together mine from fragments. The scars of those years weren't always visible, but they were real. I carried them in the way I hesitated to trust others, in the way I flinched at moments of joy, afraid they would vanish as quickly as before. Resilience wasn't a sudden transformation, it was built slowly, day by day, out of necessity. I had to teach myself that my worth did not disappear simply because others failed to see it. I had to remind myself, over and over, that being abandoned did not mean I was unlovable. Still, there were days when the pain was too sharp to ignore. I would see families together in restaurants, mothers and daughters laughing over coffee, and I felt a piercing ache that words could never capture. It wasn't jealousy as much as it was grief, grieving a bond that had once been mine, grieving a life I no longer recognized. I mourned even though no one had died, because loss comes in many forms, and this one was just as devastating. Through it all, I learned to create a version of life that belonged only to me. It wasn't easy. It wasn't filled with the love I had once known. But it was mine. I found comfort in simple things: a blooming flower in the garden, the warmth of sunlight streaming through the window, the sound of rain tapping against the roof. These small moments became reminders that life, even in its harshest seasons, still carried fragments of beauty. 5 years of silence and absence shaped me in ways I never expected. They stripped me of illusions, but they also gave me a resilience I didn't know I had. I had endured the rejection, the loneliness, and the unspoken scars. And though I carried pain, I also carried the strength of survival. The day the invitation arrived, it felt like the air in the room shifted. I remember holding the envelope in my hands, my fingers trembling as though it contained something dangerous, something that could undo me all over again. I almost didn't open it. Part of me wanted to tear it up without looking inside, to protect myself from whatever words were written there. But curiosity and the faintest thread of hope made me break the seal. Inside was a neatly printed card, embossed with golden letters, announcing the grand occasion of my daughter's wedding. The words shimmered with luxury, every detail reflecting the wealth and prestige of the life she now lived. My name was included, but not with warmth or intention. It felt more like an obligation, a formality, a reminder that I still existed somewhere on the periphery. I stared at it for a long time, my heart caught between aching and disbelief. For 5 years I had been shut out, erased, and treated like a ghost. Yet here, in my hands, was an invitation into the very world that had discarded me. My mind raced with questions. Why now? Why me? Did she truly want me there, or was this nothing more than a gesture made for appearances? I thought about the faces I would see, the whispers that would follow me if I walked into that room, the eyes that would widen with shock. The thought of standing in front of all those people, of being thrust into the center of a life I had been excluded from, made my chest tighten with both dread and defiance. The days leading up to the event were filled with turmoil. I went back and forth between convincing myself not to go and feeling a burning need to show up. My heart told me it would be easier to stay away, to avoid reopening old wounds, but another part of me, the part that had endured years of silence and rejection, wanted to step into that space, to remind them all that I had not disappeared. I wasn't sure what I was searching for: closure, acknowledgement, or maybe just the strength to prove to myself that I could walk into the very place that had erased me and still hold my head high. I imagined what the wedding would be like, every detail dripping with opulence. A luxury venue filled with sparkling chandeliers, tables adorned with white roses, and guests dressed in gowns and suits that spoke of wealth and privilege. I could see her in my mind, my daughter, radiant in her gown, surrounded by people who had become her world in the years she had chosen to live without me. Would she even glance my way? Would she recognize the pain etched on my face, or would I blend into the background like I always had in those final years before the silence? The thought of seeing her again after all that time filled me with both longing and fear. I wanted to hold her, to tell her how much I still loved her despite everything, but I knew better than to expect a fairy tale reconciliation. This wasn't the kind of story that tied itself neatly together. I was walking into a place where my presence alone would stir the air, where my arrival would remind everyone of the unspoken history they preferred to ignore. As the day drew closer, I prepared myself not just physically but emotionally. I chose my outfit carefully, something that reflected quiet strength rather than extravagance. I didn't want to compete with a display of wealth, nor did I want to appear broken. I wanted to walk in as myself, as someone who had survived, someone who had endured 5 years of being erased yet still stood strong. I rehearsed in my mind how I would carry myself, how I would look straight ahead no matter whose eyes tried to pierce me with judgment. The invitation was more than a card. It was a challenge. It was an opening into a world I had been locked out of, a test of whether I had the courage to face it again. Holding it, I felt the weight of every scar, every lonely night, every unanswered question, and though fear and uncertainty gnawed at me, a quiet determination began to grow. I had spent too long hidden in the shadows of my own life. Now, for reasons I couldn't fully explain, fate had placed this moment before me, and I knew that stepping into it would change everything. The day of the wedding arrived with a kind of surreal heaviness, as though every step I took toward the venue carried the weight of the last 5 years. I had prepared myself as best I could, but nothing could fully quiet the storm of emotions inside me. The building itself stood like a monument to wealth and grandeur, its polished glass reflecting the soft glow of the setting sun. Guests arrived in sleek cars, laughter spilling into the air as photographers captured their perfectly styled outfits. I walked up those steps alone, my heart pounding, every muscle in my body tense. The doorman barely glanced at me as I handed over the invitation, and for a moment I wondered if he could sense the tremor in my hands, if he knew I was walking into a battlefield of memories and wounds. The moment I entered the hall, the sheer magnificence of it took my breath away. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting light across tables draped in silk, adorned with towering arrangements of flowers and gold-trimmed dinnerware. A live orchestra played softly in the background, their music weaving through the air like a spell. Everything screamed of opulence and perfection, a life carefully curated to impress. And there I was, standing just inside the doorway, feeling like an intruder in a story I no longer belonged to. At first, no one noticed me. The crowd was busy mingling, glasses clinking, laughter rising in waves. But then a few eyes turned in my direction. I could feel their gazes sweep over me, recognition dawning slowly, followed by surprise. Some faces froze, others quickly looked away, and a ripple seemed to pass through the room. My chest tightened as the whispers began, hushed tones carrying my name, stories retold in fragments behind lifted hands. I stood still for a moment, letting the weight of their stares settle on me. I wasn't sure if they saw me as a ghost or a scandal, but either way, my presence was undeniable. I moved forward with measured steps, my heels clicking against the polished floor, each sound echoing louder than I wanted it to. Every step was an act of defiance, a declaration that I refused to remain erased. The closer I walked toward the center of the hall, the more the air seemed to shift. People parted slightly as I passed, their conversations faltering. Some looked at me with curiosity, others with discomfort, and a few with thinly veiled judgment. It was as if my very existence in that room unsettled the fragile image of perfection they had built. And then, amid the crowd, I saw her, my daughter. She stood radiant in her gown, the fabric cascading around her like a dream, jewels glimmering at her neck, her face framed with elegance and youth. For a brief moment my heart clenched with pride, with love that had never died despite the years apart. But that moment was pierced by the stark reality of the distance between us. Her eyes caught mine, and time seemed to stop. There was shock in her expression, a flicker of something she tried to mask, but she could not hide the way her body stiffened, the way her perfect composure faltered. The orchestra continued to play. The laughter of others still bubbled in the corners of the hall, but in that instant, everything else faded. It was just the two of us locked in a silent confrontation, her trying to hold on to the world she had built, and me standing there as a reminder of the life she had chosen to leave behind. The tension was palpable, drawing the attention of those nearby who watched with wide eyes, waiting to see what would happen next. I kept my posture steady, my gaze unwavering, though inside I was unraveling. To walk into that space, to face her in front of everyone, was like tearing open a wound that had only just begun to scar. Yet I refused to look away, refused to shrink back into the shadows they had once pushed me into. If nothing else, I wanted her, and everyone else in that room, to know that I still existed, that I could no longer be ignored or erased. The silence between us spoke louder than any words could have. In her eyes I could see confusion, anger, maybe even fear. In mine I knew she would see resilience, pain, but also the unshakable truth of a mother's presence. No matter how far she had run, no matter how thoroughly they had tried to erase me, I was there, standing in her world, uninvited yet undeniable. The atmosphere inside that hall shifted the very second my presence became undeniable. It wasn't the kind of change you could hear in words, but the kind you could feel in your bones. A hum of whispers traveled through the crowd, growing stronger as more people realized who I was. Faces turned toward me with wide eyes, some curious, others uncomfortable, and a few openly hostile. The orchestra kept playing, but even their music seemed thinner, as if the notes themselves carried tension. The luxury, the glamour, the laughter, all of it faltered under the weight of something unspoken that had entered the room. I stood still, every nerve in my body aware of the hundreds of eyes that lingered on me, some darting away quickly, others staring without shame. It was as if my very existence had cracked the flawless mirror of perfection the event was trying to project. No one expected me to be there. No one thought I would have the audacity to step foot into this carefully crafted world. Yet here I was, and my presence alone had stirred a silence that even the clinking of glasses and forced laughter could not disguise. As I scanned the room, I caught sight of familiar faces, people who once smiled at me, dined with me, shared moments of life that felt genuine. Now, those same faces looked at me as though I were a stranger, a ghost who had wandered into their midst. Their expressions shifted quickly, masks of politeness snapping into place, but the shock lingered in their eyes. Some whispered my name as though it were forbidden. Others leaned closer to their companions, no doubt piecing together their own versions of why I had come. And then, there he was. Standing near the front, dressed impeccably, holding himself with the same pride that had always defined him. His expression faltered when he saw me. For the first time in years, his confidence cracked, and though he tried to compose himself, the faintest shadow of unease crossed his face. He didn't speak, didn't move toward me, but the air between us grew thick, charged with everything left unsaid. That moment alone was enough to make the room tremble. People noticed. They felt the shift, the sudden weight pressing down on the celebration. But the most piercing part of it all was my daughter's reaction. She had been glowing only moments before, her smile lighting up the room, the embodiment of the life she had chosen. Yet when her eyes locked with mine, her radiance dimmed. She froze, her hands tightening around her bouquet, her composure wavering just slightly, but enough for those nearby to notice. It was in that fleeting second that the truth revealed itself. No matter how far she had distanced herself from me, no matter how carefully she had crafted this new life, my presence still held power. I could see it in her face, the storm of emotions she tried to bury under layers of grace and control. The silence stretched between us, loud enough to silence even the whispers. Guests who had been buzzing with chatter now pretended to focus on their drinks or on adjusting their outfits, but their eyes kept darting back to us. It wasn't just me walking into that hall, it was everything I represented. The years of rejection, the silence, the abandonment, all of it stood there with me, demanding acknowledgement. No one dared say it out loud, but everyone felt it. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to create a scene. My very presence was the confrontation. It was the reminder they had tried to bury, the piece of history they wanted erased but could never fully destroy. I carried myself with deliberate calm, not letting my fear or hurt show. Inside, my heart was pounding, my emotions tangled between grief, anger, and an unshakable love that refused to die. But outwardly, I gave them nothing they could twist or use against me. The air felt thick, as though the chandeliers themselves were holding their breath. Every laugh that tried to rise came out brittle, every conversation forced. No one could pretend it hadn't happened. My arrival had altered the atmosphere, and there was no going back. I stood there, a living reminder of what they had done, of the bond they had broken, of the choices that had led us here. Even without a word, I had shifted the balance of the night. The wedding was still beautiful, the music still played, but underneath it all was a tension no one could escape. My silence had spoken louder than any accusation, louder than any confrontation could have. The truth hung in the air, undeniable, unshakable, and it left them all shaken. In the end, my story is not about revenge or spectacle, but about survival and truth. I was erased, forgotten, and treated as though I no longer mattered, yet I endured. For years I lived in silence, carrying wounds no one cared to see, but those scars became proof of my resilience. Walking into that wedding was not about reclaiming what was lost, it was about reminding myself, and everyone else, that I was still here. My presence alone broke the illusion that I could be replaced or forgotten. I did not need to shout or demand acknowledgement, simply standing there was enough. I had once been silenced, but in that moment, my silence carried more weight than words ever could. Life had tried to push me into the shadows, but I chose to step back into the light, and in doing so, I reclaimed myself,